Salt stings the cut on your thumb, and the sand under your feet is still cold from the night. In front of you, the water is dark glass, narrow enough to tempt you, wide enough to frighten you. Behind you, somewhere in the dimness, a child shifts against a sleeping shoulder, and a small fire gives off that dry, bitter smell of old smoke. You do not know that anyone will remember this moment. You do not know that no carved stone, no written name, no spoken promise will carry your face forward. And yet this threshold matters more than any throne room, any battlefield, any city that will come later. Because if you could step back and look at the world not with your eyes, but through the quiet record kept inside living cells, you would see that this scene stands near the beginning of one of the greatest human journeys ever traced. Today, when someone spits into a tube for a DNA test or scrolls through an ancestry report on a glowing phone screen, they are touching the far end of that same story. The out-of-Africa human migration is not just a theory about people long gone. It is an explanation for why your own family line and mine and the lines of almost everyone outside Africa bend back toward one founding dispersal that happened roughly 70 to 60,000 years ago. That is the astonishing part. Humans always moved, but that one movement left such a deep mark that the rest of the world still carries it. And here is the first twist, the one that changes how you see the map entirely. If you want to find the richest human variety, the deepest storehouse of our species' differences, you do not begin far from the place of origin. You begin in Africa, where genetic diversity is greatest, where the story is older, fuller, less narrowed by departure. What left was real, but what remained was vast. That alone would be enough to make this story beautiful. Except it is only the surface, because the people who crossed into the unknown did not walk into an empty world. If you want to follow that trail with me, subscribe, because the next step in this journey leads to strangers who were human and not quite us. Those strangers were not beasts in the dark, and they were not some fantasy people invented later to make the past feel dramatic. They were human too. Close enough that when the migrants moved beyond Africa, they did not only pass by them, they met them. And in some of those meetings, they had children together. That is one of the great reversals in this story. For a long time, people imagined the deep past as if one kind of human simply replaced another, cleanly, almost mechanically. But the cells of living people tell a softer, stranger truth. If your ancestry is outside Africa, about 2% of your DNA comes from Neanderthals. In a real, measurable way, part of your inheritance comes from people who lived in Eurasia before that founding movement spread through the rest of the world. Pause on that for a second. Somewhere in the cold grass, or near a fire that smelled of animal fat and damp wood, two groups who had been separate for a very long time stood close enough to change each other forever. You do not carry a full memory of them, of course. No one does. But the trace is there, folded inside the long chain that leads to you. And Neanderthals are only part of it. There were also Denisovans, another human group known to us through those same inherited fragments. So when you picture the Great Dispersal, do not imagine a lone stream of people moving through an empty world. Picture a world already inhabited by other human forms, each with their own histories, their own winters, their own ways of surviving. The newcomers were not stepping onto a blank stage. They were entering a human world larger than they understood. But this is only the surface, because this changes more than just the map. It changes the feeling of the map. The old story says, "We went out and others were there." The deeper story says, "We met, we mixed, and we are still carrying the evidence." not as a myth of purity, and not as some mystical secret, but as a quiet biological fact. And once you let that settle in, another question rises almost immediately. If they could meet other humans and still keep moving, still keep spreading, then how far did that journey really go? And what kind of people cross water early enough to reach a world like Australia? And that is where the journey stops feeling merely long and starts feeling almost impossible. Because walking is one thing. You can imagine sore feet, dust on the ankles, the weight of a child on the hip, the sound of wind moving through grass. But Australia changes the mood of the whole story. Humans had reached it by at least about 50,000 years ago. Let that settle for a moment. By then, people had already moved so far from that first founding dispersal that they came to a land separated by water. More likely something quieter, more fragile, more human. A group standing at a shoreline again, salt on the air, wet wood under the hand, the uneasy rhythm of waves striking rock. They would not have needed a modern map to understand what water means. They would have known, the way people always know, that crossing changes everything. Once you push away from one shore, even a little, you are trusting memory, weather, each other, and whatever waits on the far side. That matters because it tells you something about the people in this movement. They were not simply drifting. They were observing, planning, adapting. The same human line that left Africa and later met Neanderthals and Denisovans was also capable of reaching a place that required more than persistence. It required nerve. It required coordination. It required the kind of shared knowledge that lives not in stone, but in other people, in gestures, warnings, timing, and the small practical wisdom of who goes first and who steadies the load. But this is only the surface, because when you hear a date like 50,000 years ago, it is easy to turn it into a cold number and miss the real revelation. By then, the Great Dispersal was no longer just a departure. It had become a spreading web of descendants, carrying pieces of earlier encounters and making new futures in lands no ancestor from that first threshold had ever seen. And if humans could reach Australia that early, then another thought begins to press in. Not about distance this time, but about time itself. Because behind every branch of this story, behind every shoreline and every meeting, there is an older line still. One that does not begin with a crossing, but with a mother. That older line is one of the quietest and most powerful ideas in this whole story. Long before the shoreline crossing, long before people reached Australia, long before those later meetings with Neanderthals and Denisovans, there was a woman who did not know she would become a marker in the human record. She was not the first woman, not the only woman alive, not some lonely mother standing at the beginning of everything. That is where people often get this wrong. But if you follow one particular thread through living humans today, the maternal line carried in mitochondrial DNA, it leads back to a common ancestor often called mitochondrial Eve, who lived roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. The phrase sounds almost mythical, and that is exactly why it needs care. She was not Eve in the old storybook sense. She did not live alone in an empty world. She belonged to a real human population in Africa, full of other women, other families, other branches of life. The reason her line matters is much narrower and somehow more moving. Across all the births, all the daughters, all the generations that followed, her maternal line is the one that still reaches everyone alive now. If that sounds abstract, think of it this way. Imagine a candle passed from hand to hand in the dark. Many flames are burning at once. Many are warm, bright, alive. But over a vast stretch of time, some go out. Not because they mattered less or were weaker, simply because lineage is fragile and continuity is never guaranteed. What survives into the present begins to look singular only when you view it from very far away. But this is just the surface. Once you understand that one maternal thread can endure while countless others fall quiet, the whole history of human movement changes shape. The out of Africa human migration stops looking like a straight road and starts looking like a narrowing river, fed by many streams, then carried forward by only some of them. And that should make you pause for a different reason. If one maternal line can connect all living people, then your ancestry is not a neat ladder at all. It is a forest of vanished branches and surviving ones. Which means the next question is not only who left, but how a small part of a much larger African story came to shape nearly everyone beyond it. That larger African story is where the whole picture becomes both humbler and more astonishing. Because once you stop imagining the past as a single file of people marching into destiny, you begin to see what the genetics are really saying. The deepest human variety stayed in Africa, the greatest diversity of all. That matters because diversity in this sense is not a trophy. It is time made visible. It is what accumulates when a population has been living, changing, branching, and continuing in one place for a very long stretch. Think of it in plain terms. If a vast old forest sends out a handful of seeds, the new grove may flourish far away. It may spread across hills and valleys and become enormous. But it still began from only part of the original abundance. That is what happened here. Most people outside Africa descend largely from one founding migration, while Africa itself remained the fuller archive of our species. What left was powerful enough to people continents. What remained was older in its richness. You can almost feel the logic of it in your own body. Every inherited change is like a tiny mark copied forward through generations. The longer a line stays broad and deep, the more of those marks it holds. When only a smaller branch moves on, some of that variation goes with it, and much of it does not. No drama is required, no grand catastrophe, just ordinary family lines carried forward unevenly over immense time. But this is only the surface, because the phrase one founding migration can mislead you if you hear it too quickly. It does not mean one couple. It does not mean one magical day when the whole world changed at once. It means that, among the many human lives in Africa, one branch became the main ancestral source for almost everyone beyond it. A narrowing happened, a selection, not by prophecy, but by survival, movement, and continuation. And that should make the old shoreline feel different now. The group at the edge of the water was never the whole human story. They were one part of a far larger human world behind them, which raises a question that is easy to miss until now. If Africa held the deeper well of human variation, why was it this branch, and not another, that went on to leave footprints across nearly the entire planet? That question does not have a simple, heroic answer, and that is part of what makes it worth asking. It would be easy to invent one. To say this branch was braver, smarter, stronger, more destined than the others. People love stories like that. They make the past feel tidy. But the real force behind this movement was probably much less theatrical and much more human. A change in opportunity. A route that held. A chain of generations that did not break. A few groups moving a little farther than their parents, then their children doing the same, and then, without anyone planning a world history, those steps becoming the main ancestral path for nearly everyone outside Africa. You can sense how fragile that is. A handful of people at one shoreline. A few families surviving where others turn back. Children born in a new place. Grandchildren carrying part of the older variation with them. That is how vast patterns often begin. Not with a trumpet blast, but with repetition. One camp after another. One season after another. One decision to keep going when the ground ahead looks uncertain and the ground behind is already gone from sight. But this is incomplete, because when you hear that all non-African populations descend mostly from that founding movement, another danger appears. The mind wants to turn mostly into purely, and that would be a mistake. We already know the path included meetings, mixture, and inherited traces from other humans. We know, too, that the deeper human reservoir remained in Africa. So this was never a clean line drawn across a blank map. It was a living branch shaped by contact, chance, and time. And seeing that, the old question, where are people from, starts to loosen in your hands. Because the answer isn't a single point. It's layered. The branch that spread across the world came from a larger African story. Then it changed again through movement. Then it changed again through encounter. Then it changed again through distance. So the next part of this chronicle cannot stay at the level of roots alone. If you really want to understand how this great movement endured, you have to look at something less visible than coastlines and colder than stone. The slow logic written into inheritance itself, and the way time hides inside a living body. That hidden logic is quieter than any campfire scene, but in some ways, it's even more intimate, because the story we are following is not preserved only in stone or shoreline or memory. It is preserved in copying. Every generation passes on a biological record, not like a perfect photograph, but more like a long text, copied by hand over immense time. Small changes appear. Most mean nothing dramatic, but they accumulate. And when enough generations pass, those tiny differences begin to form patterns that can be read backward. That is how this journey becomes visible to us now. Not because someone left a map with arrows on it, or because ancient people paused to explain themselves to the future. We can see it because living populations still carry the marks of branching, narrowing, and connection. The body does not remember in words. It remembers in inheritance. So a movement that happened tens of thousands of years ago can still be traced inside people alive today. It feels strange if you slow down for a second. A newborn cries, a parent lifts them, a line continues. Again and again, over distances no one person could imagine. And buried within that continuation are clues. Not to every thought, not to every face, but to relationship. To who remained in the deeper human reservoir in Africa, to who belonged to that branch that spread outward, and to who later carried the traces of meetings with Neanderthals and Denisovans. But this is still surface, because inheritance does not give you a neat ladder. It gives you a web. A line may survive in one way and disappear in another. A population may grow large while still carrying only part of an older variation. A branch may travel far and become widespread, while another stays nearer the source and preserves greater depth. Seen that way, the whole shape of human history becomes less like a parade and more like water dividing, rejoining, and flowing on. And that matters for another reason too, because when people hear about ancestry, they often imagine identity as something fixed and sealed. This story refuses that. From the beginning, it was movement, survival, mixture, narrowing, continuation. Which means the next step is not just to ask where people went. It is to ask how the world itself opened and closed around them, and why one later route, across a place now lost beneath water and time, would eventually carry humans into the Americas. That changing world is easy to miss when you look only at a modern map. Today, water sits where land once stretched, and coastlines feel permanent because they are permanent to us. But they were not permanent to the people inside this long human movement. The Earth kept rearranging the options. Shorelines advanced and withdrew. Cold locked up water, then released it. Passages opened for a time and later disappeared. So when we ask how descendants of that early branch eventually entered the Americas, we are really asking how human lives met a temporary landscape and used it before it was gone. The name for that lost place is Beringia. It was not a narrow little bridge in the way schoolbook drawings sometimes suggest. It was a real region, exposed when lower sea levels connected Asia and North America. And after about 16,000 years ago, humans reached the Americas through that opening. Again, not as a single dramatic dash by a single band, but as part of the same deeper pattern we have been following all along. Movement through opportunity, carried by generations. Try to feel the strangeness of that. Ground that is now under cold water once held footsteps, breath, waiting, firelight, sleeping children. Wind would have moved across open land, where waves move now. The route existed, and then it did not. That is one of the hardest things for the modern mind to hold on to. We imagine continents as fixed stages. But the people in this story lived inside a world that kept changing the shape of the possible. But this is just the surface, because Beringia is not just a geographic curiosity. It reveals something essential about the whole human spread beyond Africa. These journeys were never only about courage. They were also about timing, about whether a corridor existed when people were ready to use it, about whether memory, climate, and family continuity lined up at the same moment. And that should sharpen the larger picture now. One branch moved outward tens of thousands of years earlier. Later descendants reached Australia. Much later still, people entered the Americas by a route that would vanish beneath the sea. The map keeps widening, but the deeper lesson is becoming clearer. Human history was not built by one march across one world. It was built by repeated meetings between human beings and fleeting windows in time. And the next one we need to look at is not a place at all, but the simple, astonishing fact that none of this happened alone. That simple fact that none of it happened alone may be the most important correction of all. When people imagine ancient movement, they often picture a single figure against a horizon. One traveler, one pioneer, one heroic silhouette. But that image breaks apart the moment you look closely at how human lives actually continue. No child survives on courage alone. No route is remembered by one mind for long. No dangerous crossing is managed by one pair of hands. From the beginning, this story belongs to groups, to shared food, shared warning, shared memory, shared care. You can almost hear it if you let the silence fill in. Low voices near embers. Someone watching the dark while others sleep. Someone lifting a child before dawn. Someone remembering where the water was last season. The people in this long expansion did not succeed because each person was extraordinary on their own. They succeeded because knowledge could move from body to body without ever being written down. A gesture, a repeated path, a place to wait, a time to leave. That is culture in its oldest form. Not monuments, not libraries, but living instruction carried inside a community. But that is only a start. Once you begin to see migration that way, the word itself starts to change. It stops sounding like a line on a map and starts sounding like trust. The branch that left the deeper African reservoir could not have endured through mere motion. It had to endure through teaching, through cooperation, through people who stayed alert when others were tired, and people who remembered what others had forgotten. Even the inherited traces we talked about earlier, the ones linking later humans with Neanderthals and Denisovans, only make sense inside a world of repeated contact between real groups, not isolated wanderers. And now a quieter realization begins to settle in. If community was the engine, then some of the most important things in this entire story left no clean fossil shape behind. Patience does not fossilize. Trust does not fossilize. The moment one person shows another where to cross, when to stop, how to carry a child through cold wind, none of that sits neatly in the ground. Which leaves us in a strange place. We know this happened. We know the branches spread. We know the traces remain in living people. But how do scientists learn a history powered by things as fragile as memory, cooperation, and timing, when so much of the evidence was never meant to last? That is the strange beauty of this science. It builds a human chronicle out of fragments that were never meant to explain themselves. A shoreline does not announce who stood there. A stretch of buried ground does not tell you what people called one another, or who carried the child, or who remembered the way back. And inheritance, for all its power, does not arrive with neat captions either. It gives patterns, not speeches. So the story has to be assembled patiently, from pieces that overlap just enough to hold together. One piece comes from living DNA, with its branching lines and narrowed paths. Another comes from the broad shape of the world we can still trace. Africa holding the deepest human variation, later populations outside it carrying the mark of that founding branch, and the inherited signs of contact with other humans along the way. Another comes from timing itself. One movement spreading outward roughly 70 to 60,000 years ago. Australia reached by at least 50,000 years ago. The Americas entered after about 16,000 years ago via Beringia. None of those facts alone gives you a full voice from the past. Together, though, they begin to sound like one. You can think of it almost like hearing a song through a wall. You do not catch every word. Some notes are muffled, some are missing entirely, but the melody is still there, if enough of it reaches you. That is how this history survives. Not as perfect memory, but as convergence. The pieces come from different directions and still point toward the same deep truth. A larger human world in Africa, one branch becoming the main source for most people beyond it. Later meetings changing that branch again, and then descendants spreading into places once thought impossibly far. But this is just the surface, because when you accept that the evidence comes in layers, another emotional shift begins. The question stops being, can we know every detail? Of course we cannot. The real question becomes, what does the shape we can know mean for the way we see ourselves now? That is where this story becomes personal in a different way. Not in the shallow sense of turning ancestry into a novelty result on a screen, but in the older sense, the one that asks what it means that your existence depends on continuity through crossings, through contact, through timing, through thousands of ordinary acts of care. And when you ask that honestly, the next myth people bring to this story starts to look very small indeed. That is where the flattering myths begin to fall apart. People often want ancestry to do something it was never meant to do. They want it to crown them, to tell them they come from a special line, a separate line, a cleaner line than other people. But the deeper you look into this story, the less room there is for that kind of fantasy. The branch that spread beyond Africa was not pure. We already know that. It carried later traces of contact with Neanderthals and Denisovans. It came out of a much larger African human world. And it survived not because it was sacred, but because it continued. That matters more than it may seem at first. Because once you remove the dream of purity, what is left is far more honest. Human history begins to look like what it really was: movement, mixture, timing, inheritance, chance, care. Not a polished bloodline or a chosen people standing outside the rest. A living network of ordinary humans, each carrying only part of a much older whole. You can almost feel the disappointment some people have with that. They want the past to hand them a medal. They want one test result, one label, one origin story that sets them apart. But this long chronicle refuses to flatter anyone in that way. If your ancestry lies outside Africa, you come from that founding branch, yes. But that branch itself came from a deeper reservoir, and it was changed again by encounters on the road. Even the maternal thread we touched earlier, the one leading back to mitochondrial Eve, is not a story of exclusivity. It is a story of continuity through a crowded human world. But this is just the surface, because myth is not always loud. Sometimes it sneaks in quietly through familiar questions. Where are you really from? What are you, exactly? Which part of you is oldest? As if identity were a box with one true answer sitting neatly inside. This history says otherwise. You are the result of layers, of older lines feeding later ones, of survival without neat borders. And once you really accept that, another shift begins. The question is no longer how to rank human origins. The question becomes something far more unsettling and far more beautiful. If almost everyone outside Africa comes mostly from one branch, while the deepest variety remained behind, then what does that do to the way we imagine difference itself? It changes the scale of difference completely. The categories people cling to in the present can feel huge while you are living inside them. Language, nation, custom, skin tone, family story, all of that feels close, immediate, solid. But when you place those differences against the deep human timeline we have been following, something remarkable happens. They begin to look recent. Real, yes. Meaningful, of course. But recent. Surface ripples on a much older water, because underneath them sits the same larger structure, a deep reservoir of human variation in Africa. One branch becoming the main ancestral source for most people beyond it. Later contact with Neanderthals and Denisovans, descendants reaching Australia by at least about 50,000 years ago, and the Americas after about 16,000 years ago through Beringia. None of that erases the identities people live with now. It simply places them where they belong, later in the story, not at the root of it. You can feel why this matters. If most non-African ancestry comes from that founding movement, then many of the lines people draw between one another today are far shallower than they imagine. And if the greatest human diversity remained in Africa, then the old habit of treating Africa as a side note to world history becomes impossible to defend. It was never a side note. It was the larger human setting from which that outward branch emerged. But this is not all, because this idea can still be misunderstood in another way. Some people hear shared ancestry and assume it means sameness. It does not. Shared origin is not sameness. The whole point of this story is that branching, mixture, adaptation, and movement happened again and again. Difference is real. It just does not mean what myths often want it to mean. It does not place human beings into sealed boxes with separate beginnings. That is the deeper correction. The farther back you go, the less the neat boundaries hold. The farther forward you come, the more layered each person becomes. Your line is not singular. It is accumulated. And once that settles in, another modern habit starts to look thinner than it did before. The habit of opening a DNA result, staring at a few labels on a glowing screen, and believing you have just discovered the final truth about yourself, when really, you have only touched the outer edge of a much older human story. That older story is exactly what a screen full of percentages can so easily flatten. A person sits at a kitchen table, phone in hand, thumb dragging across colored bars and tidy labels. The room is warm. A kettle clicks off in the background. Maybe someone laughs and says, "So that's where we're from." And in one sense, fair enough. Those modern tests can point toward broad patterns of ancestry. They can hint at relationship, at movement, at inherited connections, but they do not hand you the whole truth of yourself, neatly sorted and complete. Because the real human story, underneath those results, is far older, far less tidy, and far more beautiful. It includes that deep African reservoir of variation we've been following. It includes one branch becoming the main ancestral source for most people outside Africa. It includes later traces of Neanderthals and Denisovans. It includes descendants reaching Australia, and much later the Americas through Beringia. No modern app can hold all of that emotional weight. It can only gesture toward it. You can feel the difference, can't you? One version of Ancestry says, here is your category, here is your box, here is your answer. The deeper version says, no, what you carry is a layered inheritance, shaped by crossings, by pauses, by encounters, by lines that continued while others faded. A result on a screen may show a sliver of pattern. It does not capture the campfires, the coastlines, the waiting, the human closeness that made the pattern possible. But this goes deeper, because there is another mistake people make with Ancestry. They assume that if DNA can reveal something real, then identity must be reducible to DNA. And that simply does not follow. Culture is not a pie chart. Family memory is not a pie chart. Belonging is not a pie chart. The body carries evidence, yes, but evidence is not the same thing as essence. That is where this story becomes gentler, not harsher. You do not need a novelty claim about yourself to be part of something immense. You already are. The fact that your line and mine and countless others run back through these ancient movements is enough to humble a person if they let it. And once you stop asking a test to crown you, another question opens. If the ground keeps losing the old traces, how is it that this journey still remains so visible at all? That is the reason this journey refuses to disappear, even when so much of the old world itself has. A shoreline can drown. A camp can vanish. A path can be covered by water, dust, roots, ice. The people in this story did not build great signs for us. Most of what mattered to them was immediate. Warmth, food, children, weather, the next safe place to stop. And yet, the movement remains visible because it did not survive only in the ground. It survived in descendants. That is the part I keep coming back to. not just evidence, but endurance. The route into Australia, by at least about 50,000 years ago, the later movement into the Americas after about 16,000 years ago through Beringia, the inherited trace of Neanderthals in people outside Africa, the deeper reservoir of human diversity still within Africa. All of it stays legible because living bodies carried it forward. The Earth erased a great deal. Human continuity did not. You can feel how unusual that is. Most of history leaves broken things behind: fragments, ruins, names detached from faces. This older history left something stranger. It left relationship. It left branching lines that still meet in the present. It left a pattern in which one major dispersal shaped most populations beyond Africa, while the place of origin remained fuller, deeper, more varied. That is not a dramatic legend. It is quieter than that, and in some ways, more overwhelming. But this is only the surface, because once you understand why the story is still visible, another feeling starts to rise, almost a kind of homesickness, though not for a single place you personally remember, more like recognition. The sense that human beings have been carrying one another forward for so long that the line between stranger and relative begins to thin out. And that is where this chronicle becomes difficult in the best possible way. Because if the deepest truth here is continuity, if the people who crossed, waited, adapted, met others, and kept going are part of what made you possible, then the old habit of seeing human beings as sharply separate starts to wobble. Just wobble. Which means the next step is not another map and not another route. It is the more unsettling question this whole story has been quietly approaching from the beginning. What, exactly, are you looking at when you look into another human face? What you are looking at, whether you realize it or not, is accumulated time. A face across from you in a waiting room, on a train, at a kitchen table, in a passport photo, it feels immediate. You notice the expression, the voice, the posture, the little habits, maybe the way someone rubs cold hands together, or smiles before they finish a sentence. But beneath all that nearness sits a depth that the eye cannot see. Beyond parents and grandparents, beyond a surname or a hometown, much deeper. A history shaped by that larger African beginning, by one branch moving outward, by later encounters, by routes opening and closing under changing skies. That does not mean every face is secretly the same. It means every face is older than the categories we usually place on it, older than borders, older than the identities states record on paper, older than the arguments people use to separate themselves from one another. If most people outside Africa trace much of their ancestry to that founding movement, and all living maternal lines reach back through the same deep human past, then a stranger is never as separate as they first appear. You can feel why that idea unsettles people. Distance can be comforting. It lets us imagine that others are made by entirely different stories, as if human lives began in sealed containers. But this chronicle keeps undoing that illusion. The same species that carried traces of Neanderthals, that reached Australia early, that later entered the Americas through Beringia, also carried forward something simpler and harder to dismiss: connection. Not sentimental connection, biological connection, historical connection, the kind that remains even when memory fails. But this is only the surface, because once you start seeing other people that way, the story turns back on you. It is no longer only about humanity in the large. It becomes uncomfortably personal. You begin to ask what exactly in your own sense of self is ancient, what is recent, and what has been handed to you so quietly that you never thought to question it? And here the ground shifts again. Because ancestry is not just something that happened to people long ago. It is happening every time a line continues. Every time a child inherits more than names. Every time the past moves forward without announcing itself. Which means the next thing we have to face is not another route on the map, but a more intimate truth. Survival in this story was never abstract. It was carried through ordinary families, one generation at a time. That is the part people miss when they turn this story into arrows on a map. A line on a map has no weight. It does not cry when it is hungry. It does not get tired at dusk. It does not stop because someone small cannot walk any farther. But the movement we have been tracing was carried by families, and that changes the whole emotional scale of it. Not because it makes the science softer, but because it makes it real. Every continuation in this story depended on ordinary human closeness. Parents, children, siblings, elders, all the quiet bonds that make survival possible from one generation to the next. You can picture it without forcing anything dramatic. A child asleep against warm skin. Someone saving the easier piece of food for the smaller mouth. Someone slowing their pace because another person cannot move as fast. The great outward branch did not continue through abstraction. It continued because people kept one another alive long enough for another morning, another season, another birth. That is true whether they were still within Africa's deeper human reservoir, whether they belonged to the branch that moved beyond it, or whether their descendants later carried traces of other human groups as well. But this is the surface, because once you think in generations instead of journeys, the entire meaning of survival changes. Survival is not only an individual matter here, it is a chain. One person reaches adulthood because someone cared for them. One line continues because enough people stayed together long enough for children to grow, learn, remember, and then carry the line onward. When you say that most people outside Africa descend largely from one founding movement, what you are really describing is not a single triumph. You are describing thousands upon thousands of successful handoffs. That is why the story feels so intimate once it gets under your skin. You are not only descended from people who moved, you are descended from people who cooperated well enough, long enough, often enough for motion to become lineage. And now the emotional pressure shifts again. Because if that ancient continuity was built through family life, through repeated care, through one generation receiving what the last could pass on, then the biggest mistake would be to imagine the people who stayed behind as somehow less central to the story. In fact, the closer you look, the more the center has been there all along. The center was never the far horizon people like to celebrate. It was the place where human depth remained greatest. Africa was not simply the launch point for everyone else's story. It was, and in the genetic sense still is, the fuller human archive. The widest variation stayed there. The older branching stayed there. The larger reservoir from which that outward branch emerged stayed there. Once you understand that, the whole emotional balance of this chronicle changes. What left mattered enormously, but what remained was never secondary. That correction is important because the old habit is so stubborn. People hear about the branch that spread across the world, and they instinctively treat movement as the main event, as if value lies in departure. But the science points somewhere quieter and deeper. The line that went outward carried part of an older richness. It became widespread, yes. It shaped most populations beyond Africa, yes. But it did not contain the whole human story. It could not. The source was larger than the branch. You feel how that changes the map in your mind. Africa stops being a backdrop and becomes what it always was in this history, the living heart of it, the place where the longest continuity ran, where the deepest variation accumulated, where the wider human world already existed before later descendants moved into other continents and eventually reached places as distant as Australia and the Americas. Suddenly, the outward spread no longer looks like the rise of humanity from a starting block. It looks like one stream flowing from a vast spring. But this is just the surface, because when you restore that center, another illusion begins to crack. The illusion that the people who moved were the real ancestors, while those who stayed somehow belonged to a separate or lesser story. In truth, there is no clean split like that. The people who remained and the people whose descendants moved outward belong to the same deep human fabric. One part became the main source for most non-African populations. The larger fabric remained richer still. And that is where the emotional weight begins to deepen again. Because if the center of the story has been misunderstood this badly, then maybe the word origin itself has been misunderstood too. Maybe it does not point to a single dramatic launch at all. Maybe it points to something much more intimate and much harder to simplify. That intimacy is exactly why the word origin can mislead us if we let it harden too much. People hear the word and imagine a starting pistol, a launch, a clean first moment when everything important began. But this human story resists that kind of neatness. The place of origin was never empty except for one chosen line waiting to depart. It was full of branches, families, continuities, losses, births, remembered paths, forgotten paths. Full of people who mattered whether their descendants later crossed into other continents or remained within that deeper and older human field. Once you see that, the whole idea of where we come from becomes more intimate than dramatic. It is not just a matter of geography. It is a matter of continuity inside a living population. The people who formed that outward branch were not floating above the rest. They were part of that larger human world. Their descendants would spread far. Most non-African populations would trace much of their ancestry to them, but they were never separate from the source that made them possible. You can feel how different that is from the versions people often carry around. Those versions want a clean dividing line, before and after, here and there, us and them. This story gives you something older and less convenient. It gives you a human fabric with one thread becoming globally widespread, while the fabric itself remains broader than the thread. It gives you Africa not as a prelude, but as the deepest setting of all. But this is only the surface, because once origin stops meaning one dramatic beginning, another realization begins to take shape. The people who moved outward did not leave humanity behind them. They carried one part of it forward. The people who stayed did not fall out of the story. They remained inside its richest continuity. Suddenly, the old question, where did we begin, starts turning into a better one. Where did one branch go? Not where did one root open, but what kind of species keeps producing connection even as it spreads, divides, meets others, and changes? And that question brings us very close to the heart of the whole chronicle. Because if origin is really continuity, and continuity is really relationship carried through time, then the next thing we have to face is this. Maybe the deepest inheritance in this story is not a root at all, but a way of belonging to one another that began long before any border ever did. That kind of belonging is so old that it almost disappears from view. Not because it is weak, but because it is everywhere once you know how to look. It sits underneath the later things that shout louder: flags, borders, categories, arguments about who belongs where. Those are real in their own time, of course. They shape lives, they matter, but they are young compared with the human pattern beneath them. The older pattern is this: a species emerging in Africa, one major branch spreading outward, meeting other humans, changing as it moved, while the deeper reservoir remained at the source. Once you hold that in your mind, a strange calm begins to replace the old hunger for separation. You stop needing every difference to mean a different beginning. You stop needing ancestry to prove distance. The story becomes harder to weaponize that way. A person can still be local, rooted, devoted to a language, a family memory, a place. All of that remains true. But underneath it is a history in which even the farthest traveled descendants still belong to something older and shared. You can sense how radical that is without anyone raising their voice about it. The line that led beyond Africa did not become important because it escaped humanity. It became important because it carried one part of humanity into more and more places. It remained connected to the larger human fabric even as it changed through time, through contact, through those later traces we've already followed. The story never rewards the fantasy of standing apart. It keeps bringing you back to relation. But this is only the surface, because there is still one final temptation people bring to this chronicle. They hear shared ancestry, and they mistake it for a vague, sentimental slogan, something soft, something easy, as if saying we are connected means pretending history is simple, or pretending all difference disappears if you squint hard enough. That is not what this story says at all. It says something more demanding. It says connection is real, even when difference is real. It says shared origin survives without erasing later branching. It says continuity can hold complexity. Once you accept that, the last resistance begins to weaken. Because the question is no longer whether human beings are connected in some abstract sense. The question becomes whether you are willing to let that knowledge change the way you imagine yourself and everyone else standing under the same sky. That change in imagination is the real threshold now. The threshold now is no longer the old shoreline, the lost land bridge, or even the first outward branch itself. It is inside the mind of the listener. Inside the moment when history stops being a list of ancient movements and starts becoming a challenge to the way you hold human difference in your head. Because once you know the larger shape, the deeper variation in Africa, the branch that spread outward, the later traces of other human groups, the long continuation through families, you cannot quite return to the smaller story you had before. You may still try, of course. We all do. Everyday life is local, immediate. You wake up in one home, in one language, with one name, one set of memories, one circle of people you call your own. That is natural, necessary even. But beneath that local life is a deeper pattern that keeps pressing upward. It says your personal history is real, but it is not the beginning. It says belonging is real, but it was never meant to be a wall. It says ancestry is meaningful, but only if you can bear its complexity. You can hear how demanding that is. It asks you to hold two truths at once. One, people are shaped by different places, different stories, different inheritances. And two, those differences grew out of a shared human past far older than any of the labels we now use to divide ourselves. The Great Dispersal did not erase distinction. It made later distinctions possible, but it placed them on top of something prior, something common, something that keeps refusing to vanish no matter how fiercely people insist on separation. But this is only the surface, because the deepest challenge here is emotional. It is one thing to say, Yes, we all come from somewhere older and more connected than we thought. It is another thing to let that knowledge soften the instinct that always wants to sort, rank, protect, and exclude. Science can show the pattern. It cannot force the heart to accept it. And that is why the final stretch of this story matters so much. Because we are no longer asking where the lines on the map went. We are asking what kind of humility this history demands from us now. And why the oldest answer may also be the gentlest one. That gentleness does not come from pretending the story is simple. It comes from finally seeing how large it is. When people ask, "Where are you really from?" they usually mean something narrow, a country, a people, a recent line of memory. And those answers matter. They are not false. But they are incomplete in a way that becomes impossible to ignore once you have walked through this older human chronicle. Beneath every local answer is a longer one, a deep African beginning, one branch spreading outward, later encounters with other human groups, descendants reaching far shores, and continuity carried forward through families who never imagined they were shaping the future of the species. You can feel the scale of that if you stop for a moment. Before passports, before kingdoms, before anything we would recognize as a modern border, there were already people carrying this story in their bodies. Some remained within the richest human reservoir. Some belonged to the branch that moved beyond it. Their descendants later reached Australia. Much later, others entered the Americas through Beringia. None of those later destinations cancels the earlier truth. They all rest on it. They all depend on it. But this is only the surface, because even now, the mind still resists the full implication. It wants to shrink the story back down into something manageable, something tribal, something that can be owned. Yet this history keeps refusing ownership. It does not belong to one nation, one myth, one proud lineage. It belongs to anyone who is human. And that is precisely why it feels so difficult to hold. The farther back you go, the less exclusive the story becomes, and the more intimate. That is the turn we are standing in now, a turn in perspective. The old question was, which people crossed? The deeper question is, what does it mean that so many of us still carry the result? That one is harder to answer with pride alone. It asks for humility. It asks you to see your own life not as an isolated possession, but as one brief continuation in a chain that began long before your name. And once you allow that chain to come into view, one last image returns with a force it did not have at the beginning. The dark water, the waiting figures, the first step outward, and the quiet truth of what exactly they left behind. What they left behind was not emptiness. That is the last correction before this story can fully land. The old imagination still wants the scene to work like this. A small band steps away, and history follows them. Everyone else fades into the background. But that is not what the evidence has been telling us. The people who remained were the larger story. The deepest human variation remained with them. The longer continuity remained with them. The broader human field from which that outward branch emerged remained with them. The departure matters enormously, yes, but it does not become meaningful by making everyone behind it less important. You can feel how different that makes the shoreline. The figures at the water's edge are no longer heroes escaping a quiet past. They are part of a living, already ancient human world extending behind them farther than they can imagine. Fires inland, families inland, other branches of memory, kinship, and change inland. The movement outward becomes more moving once you understand that it came from fullness rather than lack. But this is only the surface, because now another emotional inversion begins. We usually think of ancestry as a trail leading away from the source, toward us, as if the goal was always the present moment. But this story resists that, too. The point was never us in some flattering modern sense. The point was continuity itself. The fact that human life kept branching, continuing, carrying memory in bodies and relationships, whether people crossed new thresholds or remained in older ones. That is why the scene at the water keeps returning. Not because it is the whole story, but because it lets you feel the tension between movement and belonging. To step away is to carry something with you. Not only genes, not only survival. A whole human inheritance shaped long before the crossing. And even after the departure, the source does not vanish. It continues. It deepens. It remains. So when you picture that first step now, it should feel less like an escape and more like a thread being drawn from a larger cloth. And once you see that cloth clearly, there is only one question left. Not where the thread went, but what it means that the cloth still holds all of us together, even now. What it means is almost too simple for how vast the story has become. Simple in the way deep truths often are once all the noise falls away. The cloth still holds because the people in it were never truly separate in the way later myths wanted them to be. Branches, yes. Distances, yes. Different routes, different futures, different landscapes underfoot. But not separate beginnings. Not sealed off kinds of people standing outside one another. The history we have followed keeps returning to the same quiet fact. One human world, oldest and deepest in Africa, with one major branch spreading outward and changing along the way without ever becoming something apart from the rest. You can feel the force of that now in a way you could not at the beginning. The shoreline is still there in your mind. The waiting figures are still there. But now the scene carries more weight. They are not leaving a blank continent behind them. They are not carrying the whole meaning of humanity on their backs. They are one continuation among many. One thread drawn outward from a fabric that remains larger than the thread itself. That is why the story feels reverent instead of triumphant. It was never about one group winning the earth. It was about continuity enduring. But this is only the surface, because there is still one final temptation to resist before the story can close. The temptation to turn this truth into a slogan so broad it loses its sharpness. "We are all connected" can become a lazy phrase if you let it. This chronicle is asking for something more exact than that. It is asking you to remember what the connection consists of. Generations of actual people, actual children, actual crossings, actual inherited traces, actual branches that survived and branches that did not. A real demanding kinship written through time. And once you see connection that way, something else happens. The stranger in front of you stops being only a stranger. Not because difference disappears, not because history becomes soft, but because you can no longer pretend the distance between you is absolute. So now, with only one step left in this journey, the question is no longer where humanity went after Africa. It is what kind of gratitude and what kind of responsibility should follow from knowing that none of us arrived here alone. That responsibility begins, strangely enough, with the scene we have already stood inside, and now, at last, understand. The dark water is still there. The cold sand is still there. A child still shifts in someone's arms. A hand still tightens around a bundle before dawn. But the scene has changed because you have changed. At the beginning, it looked like departure. Now it looks like inheritance in motion. Not a chosen people stepping out of obscurity. Not a clean break from everyone behind them. Not the first chapter of some flattering myth. Just human beings carrying forward one part of a much older human world. A world deepest in Africa, rich with lines that remained, while one branch moved outward and later met others, changed, spread, and endured. That is the resolution hidden inside this entire chronicle. Tracing humanity back to one great dispersal makes humanity larger. It takes the old hunger for special exemption and replaces it with something harder and more beautiful: continuity. You are not standing at the top of a private ladder. You are standing in the latest moment of a chain that passed through mothers and children, crossings and pauses, remembered paths, vanished shores, and lives no one alive can name. And the wisdom of it is not grand at all. It is as plain as a footprint filling slowly with water. The step is gone almost as soon as it is made, but the person who made it has already passed something onward. By sunrise, the shore is only light on wet sand again. The smoke thins. The figures are swallowed by distance, not into legend, but into morning. If this story stayed with you, stay with the channel. And if you want, leave a word in the comments about the part that changed the way you see human origins.